A quiet roadside diner, a storm raging outside. The neon sign flickers in the rain, casting eerie shadows on the wet pavement. Inside, everything seems normal, until the door swings open. A group of dangerous men steps in, and the night takes a turn no one expected. But in the corner, unnoticed, sits a man who is about to change everything. What happens next will leave everyone speechless. Stay until the end to see how this night unfolds. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more powerful stories. What would you do in this situation? Let us know in the comments. Also, tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to know. The neon sign flickered against the rain-soaked night, casting a dim red glow onto the glistening asphalt outside the small roadside diner. The storm had turned the highway into a river of reflections, headlights from passing cars stretching like ghostly streaks across the pavement. Inside, the atmosphere was warm, filled with the scent of coffee, sizzling burgers, and freshly toasted bread. A slow blues tune hummed from the old jukebox in the corner, blending with the quiet murmur of conversations from the few late-night patrons seeking shelter from the storm. Jean-Claude Van Damme stepped inside unnoticed, his entrance marked only by the soft chime of the small brass bell above the door. He wore a fitted black shirt under a worn leather jacket, dark jeans, and boots that carried the dust of many roads. His presence was unassuming, his movements smooth and effortless. He wasn't just another traveler stopping for a late-night meal. There was something about the way he carried himself, something quiet yet commanding. He had seen much of the world, had lived through experiences few could understand. But tonight, he wasn't looking for trouble. He only wanted a meal and a moment of peace. The waitress moved between the tables, her steps quick and efficient. She was in her early 30s, her dark curls pulled into a ponytail, her name tag reading Sarah. She had the tired grace of someone accustomed to long shifts, balancing plates and wiping down counters with the ease of repetition. But something about her posture was off. Her shoulders were tense, her movements slightly rigid. Her eyes flickered toward the entrance more often than necessary, as if expecting something unpleasant. Jean-Claude took in these details automatically. Years of discipline had trained his instincts to recognize tension, to sense unease even when it was buried beneath the surface. He watched as Sarah approached his booth, pulling out a small notepad from her apron. "Good evening, sir. What can I get you?" Her voice was polite, but there was strain in it, as if her mind was elsewhere. Jean-Claude offered a small nod. "Double burger, fries, and coffee." She jotted it down quickly, coming right up. As she turned back toward the kitchen, Jean-Claude noticed the stiffness in her movements. It wasn't just exhaustion, it was something deeper. Settling into his seat, he leaned back slightly, stretching his legs under the table. He wasn't a stranger to places like this, places where fear lingered just beneath the surface, masked by routine. The other patrons were quiet, hunched over their meals, keeping to themselves. A trucker sat at the counter, flipping through a newspaper. An elderly man near the window stirred his coffee absent-mindedly. No one spoke louder than necessary. It was as if the entire room was waiting for something to happen. Sarah's movements became slightly quicker, her eyes flicking toward the door more frequently. Then it happened. The front door slammed open, the bell above it jangling violently. A gust of cold air swept inside, carrying the scent of damp leather and cigarette smoke. 5 men strode in, their heavy boots thudding against the wooden floor. The atmosphere in the diner shifted immediately. Conversations died, heads ducked down, eyes turned away. It was a collective decision. No one wanted to be noticed. Jean-Claude didn't turn his head, but he didn't need to. He could feel their presence, the arrogance in their steps, the way they spread out slightly as they moved. They weren't here for food. Sarah had gone rigid behind the counter, her knuckles whitening around the coffee pot she was holding. The leader of the group, a stocky man with graying hair and a deep scar across his cheek, surveyed the room with the air of someone who already owned it. His name was Harry, and his pale blue eyes settled on Sarah with a smirk. "Well, well," he drawled, stepping toward the counter. "Look who's still here." Jean-Claude saw it then, the way Sarah's jaw tightened, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter. There was history here. Harry planted both hands on the counter with a loud slap. "Thought you'd have learned by now, girl." Sarah's voice was steady, though Jean-Claude could hear the edge in it. "Whatever you want, I'm not giving it to you." One of the other men, a lanky figure with a chipped tooth, let out a short laugh. "Oh, I think you will. You always do, eventually." Sarah didn't move. "This is a business, not your playground." Harry chuckled, shaking his head. He reached out, plucking a sugar packet from the counter, rolling it between his fingers. "See, that's where you're wrong," he said. "This diner is on our territory, which means you pay if you want to keep it running. That's how things work around here." The tension in the room thickened, suffocating. Jean-Claude felt it pressing down like a heavy weight. He could see it in the way the other patrons kept their heads down, in the way Sarah stood her ground but with her hands trembling slightly. Fear had lived in this place for a long time, and Jean-Claude despised it. Sarah lifted her chin. "I told you last time, I'm not giving you a damn cent." Harry sighed dramatically, tossing the sugar packet onto the counter. "See, I don't like that attitude. That kind of disrespect gets people into trouble." He turned slightly, glancing at his men. "Doesn't it, boys?" The chipped-tooth biker grinned. "Oh yeah, big trouble." Another biker, a wiry man with a tattoo crawling up his neck, suddenly reached over and knocked a tray of silverware off the counter, sending a loud clatter of knives and forks onto the floor. Sarah flinched. Jean-Claude's grip on his coffee mug tightened slightly. Harry leaned in closer to Sarah, his voice dropping just enough to make the threat feel more personal. "You either pay up or bad things start happening," he murmured. "Windows get broken, fires start, people get hurt." Then he reached for her wrist. Jean-Claude moved before he even thought about it. His hand shot out, catching Harry's wrist in a firm grip. It wasn't violent, but it was unyielding. A dead silence fell over the diner. The only sound was the faint hum of the jukebox in the corner. Harry turned his head slowly, eyes narrowing as he registered the strength in the grip holding him. His gaze traveled up, taking in the man sitting in the booth, the calm but unmistakably dangerous look in his dark eyes. One of the bikers whispered, his voice barely audible, That's Jean-Claude Van Damme." Jean-Claude didn't move. He didn't speak. His fingers tightened slightly around Harry's wrist. A silent message, a warning. The air in the diner had changed. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one that was about to unfold inside. A heavy silence fell over the diner, the weight of unspoken tension pressing down like a storm cloud ready to break. The only sound that remained was the soft hum of the jukebox, its slow blues tune feeling eerily out of place in the charged atmosphere. Jean-Claude Van Damme remained seated, his grip firm around Harry's wrist, his expression unreadable. The other bikers had stopped laughing, their smirks replaced with uncertainty as they took in the situation. They had come in expecting to intimidate, to take what they wanted as they always had, but now they found themselves face to face with a man who did not fear them. Harry's pale blue eyes narrowed as he stared at Jean-Claude, his pride and temper flaring at the silent defiance. He was used to being the one in control, the one who dictated how things went in this town. For years, no one had dared to challenge him, certainly not some stranger sitting quietly in a booth as if he owned the place. His fingers twitched, tensed in the grip holding him in place, but there was no give. Jean-Claude's hold was like iron, calm but unyielding. Harry let out a slow chuckle, masking the frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "Well, damn," he muttered. "Looks like we got ourselves a tough guy." He turned his head slightly, casting a glance at his men, as if gauging their reaction. The lanky biker with the chipped tooth forced a laugh, though it sounded hollow. "Yeah, real tough," he echoed, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Jean-Claude remained silent, his gaze never wavering. He had encountered men like this before, bullies who thrived on fear, who relied on their ability to push others down in order to lift themselves up. But fear was a fragile thing. The moment someone refused to bow to it, the illusion of power began to crack. Harry's jaw tightened. He couldn't afford to back down, not in front of his men. Slowly, he pulled his arm back, testing Jean-Claude's grip once more. The hold remained firm for a heartbeat longer before Jean-Claude finally released him. Harry took a step back, rolling his wrist as if shaking off the sensation of being held. "All right," Harry said, his voice smooth but laced with something darker. "You made your point." He took a slow breath, flexing his fingers. "But let me make mine." Without warning, he swung. The punch came fast, but Jean-Claude was faster. He leaned back just enough for Harry's fist to miss its mark, the air cutting between them. In the same motion, Jean-Claude's leg shot out, his foot connecting sharply with Harry's shin. It wasn't enough to do serious damage, but it was enough to send a clear message. Harry stumbled back, his face twisting in shock and rage. The other bikers reacted instantly. The wiry one with the tattoo lunged first, his hands reaching for Jean-Claude's collar in an attempt to yank him out of the booth. Jean-Claude allowed him to get close before he moved, fluid as water. He twisted to the side, grabbing the man's wrist and pulling him forward. The momentum sent the biker crashing onto the table, silverware clattering as his body slammed into the hard surface. The chipped-tooth biker rushed in next, swinging wildly. Jean-Claude ducked under the first punch, his movements controlled, precise. His elbow shot up, catching the man under the chin, sending him staggering backward into a chair that toppled under his weight. Harry cursed, his face flushed with fury. He wasn't used to being made a fool of, especially not in front of an audience. The remaining two bikers hesitated for just a second, exchanging a wary glance before deciding they had no choice but to attack. Jean-Claude rose from his seat, his posture relaxed yet completely prepared. The first of the two came at him swinging, but his strikes were wild, driven by emotion rather than skill. Jean-Claude sidestepped with ease, catching the man's wrist and twisting it sharply. A pained yelp followed, and a second later, Jean-Claude drove his palm into the biker's chest, sending him crashing into the counter. The last of them tried to grab a chair, lifting it over his head in an attempt to bring it down on Jean-Claude. But before he could complete the motion, Jean-Claude delivered a powerful spinning kick, his boot striking the biker's arm with pinpoint precision. The chair flew from his grasp, clattering to the floor as he doubled over in pain. Harry wiped at his mouth, his breath ragged. He had expected an easy night, a routine shakedown, but instead he was staring at the wreckage of his own men, groaning on the floor of the diner. His fingers curled into fists, and for the first time, doubt flickered in his expression. Jean-Claude took a slow step forward, his breathing steady, his gaze locked onto Harry's. "You should leave," he said, his voice calm, but carrying the weight of an undeniable warning. Harry gritted his teeth. His pride screamed at him to fight, to reclaim control, but his body told him otherwise. His men were down. His plan had crumbled the moment he had underestimated the man in front of him. A heavy silence followed. The other patrons sat frozen, barely daring to breathe, their eyes darting between Jean-Claude and Harry. Then, finally, Harry took a step back. "This isn't over," he muttered, his voice low with seething frustration. He cast a final glare at Jean-Claude before turning toward his men. "Get up." One by one, the bikers dragged themselves to their feet, groaning as they did. Their arrogance had been replaced by something colder: humiliation, anger, and the bitter taste of unexpected defeat. The door swung open, the bell above it jingling as they stepped outside into the rain. The neon light flickered against the wet pavement, reflecting off their retreating figures. Inside the diner, the tension lingered, but the shift was undeniable. The weight that had hung over this place for so long had begun to lift. Sarah let out a shaky breath, her hand still gripping the edge of the counter. Her voice was quiet but steady. "You didn't have to do that." Jean-Claude turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Yes, I did." She swallowed, glancing toward the door where the bikers had vanished. "They'll come back." Jean-Claude nodded. "Maybe." The rain outside continued to fall, a rhythmic patter against the windows. The fight was over, but something told Jean-Claude that this night was far from finished. The air inside the diner remained thick with tension even after the bikers had left. The low hum of the jukebox continued to play, the slow blues tune feeling like the only thing untouched by what had just happened. The other patrons sat in silence, their eyes darting cautiously between each other, pretending to focus on their meals, but the atmosphere had changed. Fear still lingered, but there was something new beneath it, something unspoken. Jean-Claude Van Damme remained standing in the center of the room, his presence as steady as ever. His breathing was calm, his posture relaxed, yet every muscle in his body remained prepared. He knew men like Harry too well. The fight was never over after the first encounter. There was always more. He had seen it in the way Harry had looked at him before leaving, the promise of unfinished business burning behind those pale blue eyes. Sarah stood behind the counter, gripping the edge with white-knuckled hands. Her breath was uneven, her heart still racing from the confrontation. She had spent years knowing what it meant to be afraid. She had dealt with Harry and his men for so long that their presence had become a routine nightmare, a cycle she had never been able to break. But tonight, that cycle had been shattered. She should have felt relief. Instead, all she felt was the cold, creeping dread of knowing that this wasn't the end. Jean-Claude turned to her, his eyes steady. "Are you all right?" Sarah swallowed hard before nodding. "Yeah, I think so." It wasn't entirely true, and they both knew it. The trucker, sitting at the counter, let out a low whistle, shaking his head as he reached for his coffee. "Damn," he muttered. "Ain't never seen nobody take those boys down like that." He glanced toward Jean-Claude, studying him with something that resembled admiration. "You some kind of fighter." Jean-Claude didn't answer immediately. He reached for his coffee cup, took a slow sip, then set it back down. "Something like that." The trucker chuckled. "Well, whatever you are, you sure made a mess of 'em." Sarah exhaled, running a hand through her hair before turning back toward the grill. "They're going to come back," she murmured, mostly to herself, but loud enough for Jean-Claude to hear. He didn't argue. He didn't tell her she was wrong because she wasn't. Men like Harry didn't walk away from something like this. His pride wouldn't allow it. He had built his reputation on fear, and tonight, that reputation had been cracked. The only way to repair it was through retaliation. The rain continued to patter against the windows, streaking down the glass in uneven rivers. The neon sign outside flickered, its glow distorted by the downpour. Jean-Claude glanced at the door. "When do they usually come?" Sarah turned to him, her expression tight. "Depends. Sometimes a week, sometimes a few days." She hesitated, her fingers gripping the counter harder. "Sometimes the same night." Jean-Claude nodded. He had already considered that possibility. If Harry's ego was wounded enough, he wouldn't wait. He'd come back as soon as he could gather more men, more weapons, more anger. Sarah's jaw tightened. "I should call the cops." The trucker let out a dry laugh. "Yeah, good luck with that." He stirred his coffee absently. "Cops around here don't get involved in Harry's business. Either they're scared of him, or they got their hands in his pocket." Jean-Claude could see the frustration in Sarah's eyes, the way she clenched her teeth at the truth she already knew. She had never counted on the police to help her before, and tonight wasn't going to be any different. The trucker sighed, setting his cup down with a small clink. "You got lucky tonight," he muttered, glancing at Jean-Claude. "But luck don't last long round here." Jean-Claude remained silent. He wasn't a man who relied on luck. Sarah turned back to the counter, her hands moving with mechanical precision as she wiped it down, trying to keep herself busy. "I can't just sit here and wait for them to come back," she muttered. Jean-Claude studied her for a moment before speaking. "Then don't." She frowned, glancing at him. "What's that supposed to mean?" He leaned slightly against the counter, his tone calm but firm. "You've been letting them control you. You've been reacting to them, waiting for them to show up, waiting for them to decide what happens next." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Stop waiting." Sarah scoffed, shaking her head. "And what am I supposed to do? Take them all on by myself?" Jean-Claude didn't answer immediately. He simply met her gaze, unwavering. The silence between them stretched. Then, finally, Sarah exhaled. "You really think I can fight them?" He tilted his head slightly. "You already did." She hesitated, processing his words. The trucker chuckled again, shaking his head. "Hell, she's got more guts than most folks in this town." He shot a look toward Jean-Claude. "But guts ain't enough. You really planning on sticking around for round 2? Jean-Claude didn't respond right away. He had been on the road for a long time, passing through places like this, places where people suffered in silence, where men like Harry thrived because no one stood against them. He had never been the type to involve himself in other people's business. But sometimes trouble found him whether he wanted it or not. He glanced at Sarah. "I'll be here," he said simply. Sarah swallowed, nodding slowly. She didn't know why, but something in those words made her feel safer than she had in years. Outside, the rain continued to fall, the neon light flickering weakly in the storm. The fight was over, but everyone in that diner knew the night was far from finished. The rain outside had intensified, turning into a steady downpour that rattled against the diner's windows. The neon sign flickered erratically, its glow distorted by the wet glass. Inside, the diner had settled into an unnatural quiet. The trucker had left after finishing his coffee, muttering something about how things were about to get worse before they got better. The few remaining customers sat in hushed conversations, stealing nervous glances toward the entrance, as if expecting the door to burst open at any moment. Sarah moved behind the counter, her hands restless as she wiped down the same spot over and over again. She wasn't cleaning anymore. She was trying to keep her mind busy. Every few minutes, her eyes flicked toward Jean-Claude Van Damme, who remained seated at his booth, completely still. He had barely moved since their last conversation, his coffee untouched, his gaze distant yet alert. It was as if he was waiting for something, as if he could already see what was coming. Sarah exhaled sharply, setting the rag down. "You don't have to stay," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. Jean-Claude finally looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I know." She shifted uncomfortably. "I mean, it's not your fight. You could just leave now, go back to wherever you were headed." Jean-Claude studied her for a long moment before answering. "And then what?" Sarah swallowed, glancing at the door. "Then I deal with it," she muttered, "like I always do." Jean-Claude tilted his head slightly. "And how's that been working out for you?" She clenched her jaw, looking away. She knew what he was getting at. Every time Harry and his men came around, she endured. She did what she had to do to keep her diner from being burned to the ground. But tonight had changed everything. She had defied them in a way she never had before, and she knew there would be consequences. Jean-Claude spoke again, his voice calm but firm. "They're coming back." Sarah nodded slowly. "Yeah." Outside, the rain kept falling, washing over the empty parking lot. The storm had emptied the roads, leaving the diner isolated, vulnerable. Then, as if on cue, headlights appeared in the distance. Sarah's breath hitched as she took a step closer to the window. The beams cut through the darkness, growing brighter as the multiple vehicles approached. Engines rumbled, deep and aggressive, cutting through the sound of the rain. The pit in her stomach confirmed what she already knew. "They're here." Jean-Claude pushed his coffee aside and stood up. His movements were slow, deliberate, like a man stretching before a routine he had gone through 1,000 times before. He rolled his shoulders slightly, exhaling through his nose as he turned toward the entrance. Sarah took a shaky breath, gripping the counter for support. "How many?" Jean-Claude stepped toward the window, taking in the vehicles as they pulled up. The first was a black pickup truck, its tires splashing through puddles before coming to a stop right in front of the diner. Behind it, 2 motorcycles rumbled to a halt, their riders dressed in dark leather, their faces shadowed beneath their helmets. The third vehicle, an old, dented sedan, rolled up last, its headlights flickering as the engine cut off. Jean-Claude's eyes flickered to the side, catching Sarah's reflection in the glass. More than before. She swallowed hard. The diner door swung open, the bell above it jingling violently as Harry stepped inside. This time, he wasn't alone. He had brought more men, all of them larger, meaner, their presence filling the space with a suffocating weight. The rain dripped from their jackets, puddles forming beneath their heavy boots. Harry's lip curled as he scanned the room. His face was still marked with the humiliation from earlier, but there was something different in his eyes now. The arrogance had returned, but it was sharper, more dangerous. "Well, well," he drawled, shaking off his wet jacket. "Looks like we got ourselves a little unfinished business." Sarah felt her pulse quicken, but she forced herself to stand straight. "You need to leave." Harry laughed, a deep, cruel sound that made the other bikers chuckle along with him. "You hear that, boys? She thinks she can tell me what to do." He leaned against the counter, tapping his fingers against the surface. "See, I don't like loose ends. And tonight, we got a real big one." His gaze flicked toward Jean-Claude, his smirk widening. "I'll admit, you got some moves. Gave us a nice little show." His smile faded slightly. "But I don't like being made a fool of." Jean-Claude remained still, his expression unchanged. "Then don't act like one." The room went silent. Harry's jaw tensed, his fingers curling into a fist. His men shifted slightly, waiting for the signal. The storm outside raged on, thunder rumbling in the distance. Sarah's breathing grew shallow as she braced herself. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The diner had become a pressure cooker of tension, the air thick with unspoken violence. Harry stood at the counter, his fingers tapping against the surface with calculated impatience. His men flanked him, their expressions hard, their presence alone enough to send an unspoken message. This wasn't just a warning, this was punishment. Outside, the rain continued to fall, the sound of water dripping from their jackets adding to the eerie silence inside. Jean-Claude Van Damme stood unmoving, his posture relaxed, but his gaze sharp. He had been in situations like this before. He had seen men like Harry in every corner of the world, small-time tyrants who ruled through fear, who mistook violence for power, and he knew the only way to dismantle that power was to take away the fear. Sarah's grip on the counter tightened, her pulse hammering in her ears. She had no doubt that if Jean-Claude hadn't been there, tonight would have played out much differently. But that didn't change the fact that they were outnumbered. Harry exhaled slowly, tilting his head as he studied Jean-Claude. "Let me explain something to you, tough guy." His voice was smooth, but underneath it was the promise of what was to come. "This place, it belongs to me. She just runs it for me." He gestured toward Sarah without looking at her, as if she were nothing more than an object. "And you? You're just some passerby who stuck his nose where it didn't belong." Jean-Claude said nothing. He just watched. Harry smirked. "That silence? That's you realizing you made a mistake." Still, Jean-Claude remained motionless. His stillness only seemed to agitate Harry more. The gang leader turned to one of his men, a burly figure with a jagged scar running down his cheek. "Lock the door." The man complied immediately, flipping the latch with a loud click. The sound echoed through the room, sealing the fate of everyone inside. The few remaining customers stiffened, avoiding eye contact, pretending they weren't there. Harry stepped away from the counter, rolling his shoulders. "See, I like to give people options. That's what makes me such a reasonable guy." His eyes darkened. "Your option? Apologize, right now. You get on your knees, beg me for forgiveness, and maybe, just maybe, I don't make you regret stepping foot in this town." Sarah's breath hitched. Jean-Claude didn't move, didn't blink. Then, finally, he spoke. "No." The word was soft, but it landed like a hammer in the silence. Harry's smile vanished, his lips pressed into a thin line, his fingers flexing. "All right, then." The first punch came fast, but Jean-Claude was faster. He sidestepped smoothly, letting the swing cut through the air harmlessly. Before the attacker could recover, Jean-Claude countered with a swift strike to the ribs. The impact sent the man stumbling backward, gasping for air. The diner erupted into chaos. Two more bikers lunged forward, their movements aggressive but uncoordinated. Jean-Claude ducked under the first man's grab, driving his knee into the biker's stomach before pivoting and slamming his elbow into the side of his head. The second attacker swung a wild punch, but Jean-Claude blocked it effortlessly, twisting the man's arm and flipping him onto the ground with a controlled force that sent chairs scattering. Sarah's heart pounded as she pressed herself against the counter, watching in shock. It was like something out of a movie, but this wasn't scripted. This was real. Harry's eyes flickered with something dangerously close to hesitation, but he quickly masked it with fury. "Don't just stand there. Take him down." Another man grabbed a chair, lifting it high and swinging it down with full force. Jean-Claude stepped back just in time, the chair smashing into the floor where he had been standing a second before. With one fluid motion, he delivered a spinning kick to the attacker's jaw, sending him crashing into a nearby booth. The fight was brutal, but Jean-Claude was precise, every movement calculated. His opponents were strong, but they relied on brute force, on intimidation. They had never faced someone who could move like this, who could take them apart piece by piece without breaking a sweat. One of the bikers, a wiry man with tattoos crawling up his neck, pulled a knife from his jacket. The blade gleamed under the fluorescent lights as he lunged forward. Sarah gasped. "Knife!" Jean-Claude saw it coming. He moved quickly, catching the man's wrist before the blade could make contact. With practiced efficiency, he twisted, forcing the biker to drop the knife with a sharp cry. A second later, Jean-Claude drove his palm into the man's chest, sending him sprawling onto the floor. Harry was breathing hard now, his hands curled into fists. His men were on the ground, groaning in pain, but he refused to accept what was happening. His reputation, his control, it was slipping away in front of everyone. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a set of brass knuckles, slipping them over his fingers. "All right," he muttered. "Let's see how tough you really are." Jean-Claude exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders. He had been expecting this. Harry moved in fast, throwing a punch aimed directly at Jean-Claude's head. Jean-Claude ducked just in time, feeling the rush of air as the brass knuckles barely missed him. Before Harry could swing again, Jean-Claude countered with a quick strike to the ribs, followed by a sharp kick to the knee that forced Harry to stumble. But Harry was relentless. He recovered quickly, swinging again, this time catching Jean-Claude's shoulder with a glancing blow. The impact sent a dull ache through his arm, but he barely registered it. He had fought through worse. Jean-Claude shifted his weight, dodging another attack before delivering a powerful spinning kick that connected directly with Harry's jaw. The gang leader's head snapped back as he crashed onto the floor, his body limp. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The only sound was the rain tapping against the windows, the faint hum of the jukebox still playing its slow tune. Sarah slowly exhaled, her hands still gripping the counter. The other customers remained frozen, their wide eyes locked on the scene before them. Jean-Claude straightened, rolling his sore shoulder before glancing down at Harry. The fight was over, but the war wasn't. Sarah swallowed hard. "He's not going to let this go." Jean-Claude met her gaze. "I know." The rain outside hadn't stopped. If anything, it had only gotten worse. The night wasn't over yet. The rain poured relentlessly outside, pounding against the windows of the diner in a steady rhythm. The neon sign flickered weakly, its reflection dancing over the soaked pavement. Inside, the diner was eerily silent. The air smelled of sweat, coffee, and the lingering scent of adrenaline. Chairs were overturned, silverware scattered across the floor. The hum of the jukebox played a slow, crackling tune, an almost mocking contrast to the violence that had just unfolded. Harry lay on the ground, barely conscious, his jaw swollen from the devastating kick Jean-Claude had delivered. His brass knuckles lay a few inches away, useless now. His men were in various states of pain, some groaning, others struggling to push themselves upright, their confidence shattered. The ones still capable of moving stole uneasy glances toward their leader, waiting for him to give some kind of order. But Harry wasn't speaking. Sarah remained behind the counter, her breathing shallow. Her fingers gripped the edge of the countertop so tightly her knuckles had turned white. She wasn't shaken anymore, but she could still feel the echoes of fear lingering inside her. It had always been this way. Harry coming in, demanding his cut, taking what he wanted, but tonight had been different. Tonight, someone had finally stood against him. Jean-Claude stood tall in the center of the room, his expression unreadable. He rolled his shoulders slightly, testing the soreness from the single hit he had taken. It wasn't much. He had been through worse. His gaze flicked toward Harry, who slowly shifted, groaning as he attempted to lift himself up onto his elbows. The door rattled violently as someone outside pounded against it. "Police, open up!" Sarah inhaled sharply. The remaining customers, who had spent the last few minutes pretending they weren't there, flinched at the sound. Some of them looked toward Jean-Claude with a mixture of relief and apprehension. Would the police see him as the hero, or would they treat him like another troublemaker? Jean-Claude turned his head toward Sarah, silently asking her if she wanted to handle this. She hesitated, then moved toward the door, flipping the lock. The door swung open, and two uniformed officers stepped inside, their boots dragging in water from the rain-soaked streets. The older of the two, a broad-shouldered man with graying hair, took one look at the scene and let out a slow sigh. His name tag read Sergeant Miller. His younger partner, Officer Gaines, scanned the room quickly, his hand resting near his holster. Miller's gaze landed on Harry, who was still on the ground, trying to push himself up. "Damn it, Harry," he muttered, rubbing a hand over his face. "What the hell did you do this time?" Harry coughed, spitting blood onto the wooden floor. He didn't answer immediately. His pride wouldn't let him. Miller's eyes moved to Jean-Claude, taking in his calm demeanor, the way he stood so still despite what had clearly just happened. His gaze then shifted toward Sarah. "You want to tell me what's going on here?" Sarah straightened slightly. "They came in demanding money again," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "When I refused, they threatened me. Then they attacked him." She nodded toward Jean-Claude. "He defended himself." Miller let out another long sigh, shaking his head. "Of course he did." He turned to Harry. "That true?" Harry clenched his jaw. For a moment, it looked like he might argue, might spin some excuse or twist the story to his favor. But then his gaze met Jean-Claude's. There was no anger, no arrogance left in his eyes. There was only the dull, burning humiliation of a man who had lost everything in a single night. He knew the truth, and worse, he knew everyone else in the room knew it too. Finally, Harry gritted his teeth and looked away. "Go to hell," Miller exhaled sharply. "That's what I thought." He waved a hand at his partner. "Cuff 'em, all of 'em." Gaines moved quickly, securing Harry first, then the others who were still conscious enough to stand. Some resisted weakly, muttering curses under their breath, but none of them had the fight left in them to put up a real struggle. One by one, they were hauled to their feet, wrists bound behind their backs. Miller turned back to Sarah. "You pressing charges?" Sarah hesitated for only a second before nodding. "Yes," Miller grunted. "Good." He turned to Jean-Claude. "And you?" Jean-Claude met the officer's gaze evenly. "No." Miller studied him for a moment, then gave a slow nod. "Figures." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small notepad. I'm gonna need your statement anyway. You too," he added, glancing at Sarah. Jean-Claude simply nodded. As Miller scribbled something down, Harry was being dragged toward the door by Gaines. The gang leader suddenly twisted, wrenching his arm just enough to glare back at Sarah. His eye burned with fury, his lip curled in a sneer. "You just made the worst mistake of your life," he growled. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The fear tried to creep back in, the old habit of shrinking away from men like him threatening to take hold. But then Jean-Claude shifted, stepping slightly between her and Harry. He didn't say a word, didn't even look at Harry, but the message was clear. Harry clenched his jaw, but whatever fire had been left in him finally flickered out. Miller gave him a sharp tug. "That's enough, Harry. You talk again, and I'll add making threats to the list." Harry gritted his teeth but said nothing as he was pulled out into the rain. The others followed, their boots scraping against the floor as they were led outside. The flashing red and blue lights from the squad cars flickered through the rain, reflecting against the wet pavement. One by one, the doors slammed shut, and within moments, the cars pulled away, their sirens silent as they disappeared into the night. Sarah exhaled slowly. The weight in her chest lifted just enough for her to feel it. The diner was a mess, chairs overturned, plates shattered on the ground, the counter stained with spilled coffee. But, for the first time in years, it felt like hers again. Miller tucked his notepad away. "You need anything else?" Sarah shook her head. "No, thank you." Miller gave a small nod. "We'll be in touch." With that, he turned and followed his partner out into the rain, leaving the diner in silence once again. Jean-Claude turned to Sarah. "You all right?" She let out a shaky breath, then nodded. "Yeah," she said, her voice steady this time. "I think I am." Jean-Claude studied her for a moment, then finally nodded. Outside, the rain had started to slow. The storm wasn't over, but it was finally passing. The flashing red and blue lights had disappeared down the rain-soaked road, leaving the diner in an uneasy silence. The storm had weakened, the heavy downpour now reduced to a steady drizzle that tapped against the windows in a rhythmic pattern. Inside, the place was a mess. Chairs overturned, broken plates scattered across the floor, a coffee cup lying on its side with a dark stain spreading across the counter. The scent of spilled food mixed with the metallic tang of sweat and adrenaline. The echoes of what had happened still clung to the air, but the immediate threat was gone. Sarah stood behind the counter, her hands resting on the surface as she exhaled slowly. Her fingers still trembled slightly, but it wasn't fear anymore. It was exhaustion, the kind that came after years of holding in something heavy and finally letting it go. She glanced around at the wreckage of her diner, at the overturned tables and the mess left behind, and for the first time, she didn't feel powerless. She had spent years telling herself there was nothing she could do, that standing up to men like Harry would only make things worse. But tonight had proven otherwise. Tonight, everything had changed. Jean-Claude Van Damme sat back down in his booth, his movements calm, controlled. He stretched his arm slightly, rolling his shoulder where Harry's brass knuckles had barely grazed him earlier. It wasn't much, nothing he hadn't dealt with before. He had seen men like Harry in every corner of the world, had faced down their kind in places far worse than this. But he had stayed tonight, not because he had to, not because it was his fight. He had stayed because sometimes people like Harry needed to be reminded that fear wasn't as strong as they thought. Sarah finally broke the silence, her voice softer than before but steady. "You still want that burger?" Jean-Claude looked up at her, then gave a small nod. "Yes." A short laugh escaped her lips, surprising even herself. After everything, the absurdity of the question felt almost comforting. She shook her head, wiping her hands on her apron before moving toward the grill. The sizzle of meat hitting the hot surface filled the air, a sound so normal that it almost erased the events of the last hour. Almost. As she worked, the few customers who had stayed began to move again. The elderly man near the window adjusted his glasses and returned to his coffee as if the chaos had never happened. The young couple whispered to each other, glancing nervously toward the door every few seconds. The trucker, who had been silent since the police arrived, leaned back in his seat, shaking his head. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered, taking another sip of his coffee. "Ain't never seen nobody shut Harry down like that, not in all my years coming through here." He glanced at Jean-Claude. "You some kind of fighter?" Jean-Claude took a slow sip of his coffee before answering. "Something like that." The trucker chuckled. "Figured." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the counter. "You planning on sticking around? Because I gotta say, this town could use someone like you." Sarah glanced up at Jean-Claude, waiting for his answer. A part of her wasn't sure why she cared, but she did. Jean-Claude shook his head. "I was just passing through." Sarah nodded, not surprised but still feeling something tighten in her chest. "Figures," she muttered, flipping the burger. The trucker sighed. "Shame. People around here could use a reminder that they don't have to take crap from guys like Harry." He looked toward Sarah. "And you, girl, you got more guts than I thought. Standing up to him like that took nerve." Sarah smirked faintly, though she didn't look up. "Yeah, well, guess I finally got tired of waiting for someone else to fix things." Jean-Claude watched her for a moment. There was something different about her now. The fear was still there, but it was no longer in control. She had taken back something tonight, something she had thought was lost. The burger was ready. Sarah plated it and slid it across the counter toward Jean-Claude, along with a fresh cup of coffee. "On the house," she said. Jean-Claude raised an eyebrow. "I pay for my meals." Sarah crossed her arms, tilting her head. "After what you just did? Yeah, I don't think so." Jean-Claude considered arguing, but instead he gave a small nod of thanks before taking the first bite. The diner slowly settled back into something resembling normal. The other customers returned to their meals, the low hum of conversation picking up again, and for the first time in a long time, the place didn't feel suffocating. It felt like a place where people could breathe. The front door opened, and a young police officer stepped inside. It was Officer Gaines, the one who had helped haul Harry and his men out. He walked up to the counter, nodding toward Sarah before placing a small card on the counter. "In case you need anything," he said, his voice even. "We'll be keeping an eye on things, but just in case." Sarah picked up the card, running her thumb over the printed number. A small gesture, but it meant something. Jean-Claude glanced at the card, then back at Sarah. "Looks like you've got backup now." She smirked. "Guess so." Gaines nodded once before heading back outside, the bell above the door jingling softly behind him. Jean-Claude finished the last bite of his burger, wiped his hands, and reached for his jacket. Sarah hesitated, then spoke before she could stop herself. "You leaving now?" Jean-Claude stood up, rolling his shoulders slightly. "Yeah." She swallowed down whatever it was she had been about to say and nodded. "Well, thanks for everything." Jean-Claude met her gaze. "Take care of yourself." She nodded. "You too." He turned toward the door, pushing it open just as the rain had begun to lighten. The storm had passed. The neon sign flickered one last time, then held steady, casting a steady red glow onto the wet pavement. Sarah watched him go, standing behind the counter as the bell above the door jingled softly. She didn't know if she would ever see him again. She didn't know if she even wanted to. But one thing was certain. She would never forget this night. She glanced down at the counter, at the space where his coffee mug had been, then exhaled, shaking her head slightly. The diner was still a mess. There was still a lot to clean up. But, for the first time in a long time, she felt like she could handle it. She rolled up her sleeves, and she got to work. The storm has passed, but the echoes of this night will never be forgotten. Fear ruled this place for too long, but tonight everything changed. What would you have done in this situation? Let's talk about it in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more powerful videos. Also, tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to know. See you in the next one.